What's up, Iwu crew? It's the Raven, here to share another shocking, interesting, or just strange but very true story with you. Today we will be discussing a story that delves into the deepest, most depraved pits of humanity, showing just how twisted and deplorable things can get when adults in power have ill intentions towards the helpless children under their care. I will warn you now that the incidents shared in this video will be graphic and extremely disturbing. Before we dive into this sensitive subject matter, please keep in mind that the stories which will be presented today are allegations at this time. Now, let's get into it. The Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys sits in the quaint Florida town of Marianna, nestled in the state's panhandle a little ways west of the capital, Tallahassee. For 111 years, the formidable reform institution sat as a warning, whispers from all across the Sunshine State and southeastern U.S., echoing the same message: don't get into too much trouble, or else you're going to get shipped off to the Dozier School. Many citizens likely revered the institute as a strict and rigorous program that would help get young delinquents back on track in life. But behind closed doors, these young boys were being broken beyond repair. The YouTube channel Standard Stealth was actually able to explore parts of the rundown campus, and they were kind enough to let us use their footage throughout this video. So a big thank you to them, as these videos are extremely eerie and very eye-opening. As more horrific details continue to come out about this case, I feel that it would be an understatement to say that the acts purportedly committed at the Dozier School are some of the worst atrocities recorded in American history. I was lucky enough to speak with an actual victim who bravely shared his story of abuse and is still fighting for justice to this day, and his firsthand perspective makes hearing about these events even more real and personal.
Okay, my name is Charles Fudge. I was sent to the reform school at the age of 12. I'm one of 4 brothers that was sent there. 2 of my brothers was sent there in the 50s, and my brother George that has passed, he and I was there in 60 and 61.
As today's video goes on, you'll be learning more of Charlie's story. Be warned, this is a dark one. New Year's Day of 1900 rang in the grand opening of the Florida State Reform School, which would later go through a few name changes before ultimately settling with its trademark Dozier title, in honor of a superintendent. But who exactly was in charge of this place? Originally conceived in 1897 under a legislative act, the school was first overseen by 5 specially appointed commissioners chosen by the governor. The stated purpose was reportedly to provide a place where young offenders against the laws of our state might be separated from older, more vicious associates. Well, if the goal was to keep vulnerable kids away from dangerous adults, you'll soon see that this was a failure of epic proportions. For a considerable time, the school was the largest juvenile reform institution in the United States. A sprawling open campus that encompassed 1,400 acres, the premises felt separated from the rest of society, its own little world, often the only world its students really got to see.
Okay, when we first got there, we were taken up to the Florida School for Boys by a deputy sheriff from Bradenton, Florida. We got there early in the morning before the administration office had opened to check us in, and the place was absolutely beautiful. We thought that it was going to be a wonderful place to be at.
One of the saddest things about this situation is that it seems like so many boys with nowhere else to turn may have really thought this place would offer some semblance of a home, or at the very least hoped it would give them some help. And you know, reform is a pretty broad term, and so I found myself wondering, what did these boys do to get sent here in the first place? Well, it turns out the criteria was pretty wide-ranging, as in you could get sent to the school for theft and murder, or you could get shipped off merely for what they call incorrigibility, which seems to mean just being generally disobedient. Get caught playing hooky, smoking a cigarette, or running away from home, and you had a pretty good chance of being admitted to the institution. This was along the lines of what Charlie experienced.
We were sent there for being incorrigible. We skipped school and smoked cigarettes. Came from a poor family. Mother and Dad had divorced, and we kind of had to raise ourselves at early ages.
Former student Jerry Cooper told NPR that even a lot of orphans who simply had no place to go were sent to Marianna. He says overall, the inmates at Dozier weren't bad kids. Sure, they might have needed help in some respect, but this wasn't the place to find it. From the very beginning, the facility was subject to scrutiny, As early as 1901, there were reports of children being chained to walls, and a 1903 investigation stumbled upon the chilling discovery that the school was allegedly using leg irons on the students. Still, despite 6 total investigations being conducted during the school's first 13 active years, little was done to intervene or improve the basic quality of life for the boys, and this was only the start. A school cemetery called Boot Hill was designated on the north side of campus, an unusual addition for a youth facility in most cases. But the Dozier School soon witnessed a disproportionate number of deaths, with a 1914 dormitory fire wiping out 6 students and 2 staff members. Soon after, the flu epidemic of 1918 was reported to have tragically killed 11 boys. And despite periodic investigations in the century that followed, the Dozier School was allowed to continue operating with little interference, so it wouldn't be until 2012 when researchers from the University of South Florida, who had been authorized by the state to conduct a forensic anthropology analysis of the school grounds, would uncover sickening evidence that shocked and disturbed the entire country. 55 burials were found on Dozier School property, and a record of 98 deaths were found in historical documents. And then in 2019, workers surveying the grounds with a ground-penetrating radar in preparations to clean up the area of any pollution located something far more gruesome, what appeared to be a possible additional 27 graves. And while authorities certainly weren't prepared for this jarring outcome, it would be a lie to say that it came as a complete shock to them. That's because the Dozier School was actually shut down in June of 2011, closely following an alleged failed annual evaluation in 2009. From what I was able to gather, a large number of complaints alleging mistreatment by the guards to the inmates was in part to blame for the school's poor performance. Apparently, a 2010 report even found that some boys claimed to be subject to sexual misconduct by the staff. With all these alarming discoveries, it isn't hard to see why the state soon pulled the plug. Although interestingly, budgetary limitations was the main reason ultimately cited for the closure. Either way, after 111 years of suspicious activity, officials finally put an end to the institution. But how in the world did all these young boys die? Well, as former students have begun raising their voices and sharing horror stories of their time at the school, the real crimes which are alleged to have taken place at the infamous Dozier School are coming to light, and they are far more extreme and disturbing than anyone could have ever imagined. To put it plainly, the Dozier School is now accused of carrying out a long-standing tradition of alleged abuse, beatings, torture, and even murder. But before we get into the ongoing investigation, it is important to know the questionable history of the institution and all the red flags that should have led to its demise long ago. The early years of Dozier were fishy enough as is, with so many supposedly accidental or disease-driven deaths being largely brushed off by the public. But the school's reputation would take another serious hit in 1968, when after visiting the premises, Florida Governor Claude Kirk lamented that somebody should have blown the whistle a long time ago. He documented holes in the leaking ceilings and broken walls, bucket toilets, and no heat in the winter, ultimately declaring it a training ground for a life of crime, and quipping that if anyone found out their own kids were being kept in such circumstances, they'd be up there with rifles. Overall, it seems that living conditions were horrible and the campus was seriously overcrowded. The school underwent several staff and management shifts, but still, things didn't get any better. As the early 80s rolled in, yet another inspection claimed that the outrageous practices of hog-tying boys, and even confining them in isolation for weeks at a time, were purportedly taking place at Dozier. The list never really ends, and covering every messed-up practice documented at the school would take hours. But now I want to focus directly on the individuals, the men like Charlie who say they were silenced as boys, but now are coming forward with their stories. And within these first-hand accounts that give us a glimpse into the world these young students found themselves trapped in, is where things get truly sickening and heartbreaking. At the forefront of this movement is a collective who called themselves the White House Boys. Their name comes from a notorious building on campus, a small concrete block detention center, and without a doubt the area of the Dozier School they feared the most. This is said to have been the site of brutal, torturous beatings. Charlie got sent here almost immediately after arriving.
When you first admitted, you come in, they had grade schedules, and you come in as a rookie. And if you make 4 weeks as a rookie, then you go up the ladder to which next would have been an explorer. Well, I went in as a rookie, And the first day there, after getting my hair cut and getting my cottage assignment, that evening a boy asked me to watch out that an instructor didn't come by because he was polishing his boots with Vaseline. Guess that was illegal. And trying to take and make new friends, I said, I would watch for him. And then I saw this guy coming down the hall with a tie on, and I whispered over to the guy, "Here comes a one-armed SOB," and he reported that to the cottage father, which gave me a disciplinary report and dropped me from rookie to a grub with a 0. When you're in the grub category, if you get a disciplinary report, you go down to the White House and get the most severe beating that anyone can endure. And the second day that I was there, I got into a fight with a boy named Robert Strasberg, and apparently he was in the grub category, and we were both taken to the White House and got the most severe beating of our lives. The one-armed gentleman is the one that gave Robert Strasberg 33 licks with the leather strap. Mr. Hatton was the one that gave me 31 licks with the leather strap. And this leather strap is over a foot long and about 4 inches wide, that had some kind of an insert that made it heavy and harder on a person's back and bottom. Wherever the strap hit was from your knees up to the middle part of your back.
ABC reported that the disciplinary weapon of choice in the White House was alleged to be a leather strap lined with sheet metal. One former student, Alan Sexton, claims that there was blood on the walls, blood on the mattress he was on, blood on the pillow, saying it smelled to high heaven and that they turned on a great big industrial fan to keep people from passing by to hear the screams. This loud fan came up a lot in my research. It really stuck in the minds of the terrified kids.
Yes, there was a fan that, sounded like an airplane propeller that made the very loud noise, and that's the first thing that they turned on after the lights came on. And that just put fear in you just from the loudness of that fan going on, which I'm sure they did that to cover up the loud hits of the beatings.
I asked Charlie if he thought these guards were just carrying out orders, or did they get some sort of sick enjoyment out of these beatings?
No, I think they really enjoyed that. I was told by other boys that had been beaten that the instructors wanted to see who made the boys hurt the most. Different names for the White House. We called it also the ice cream factory. The reason the name the ice cream factory came out was because of all of the colors of our backside, from bleeding to black and blue and every color that was imaginable.
Every man's story of their time in the White House is hauntingly similar, but each reveals new details, little things that paint the bigger picture of the alleged systematic abuse. Here are some of those men and their stories. Jerry Cooper says he received the worst beating he ever got at the school, allegedly getting dealt over 100 lashes at 2 o'clock in the morning, searing the cloth of his nightgown and his underwear into his skin. He says he was sure he wasn't going to survive. He has stated that the first blow lifted him 1.5 feet off that bed, and that every time that strap would come down, you could hear the shuffle on the concrete because their shoes would slide, and you could hear the shush-shush bam. Robert Straley alleged in an interview that the staff would line the boys up against the wall. He recalls being at the end of the line, and he says they took the first boy in, and you could hear grunts and then groans, and then that turned into screams and just, "Oh God help me," and "Mommy," and noises I'd never heard before, people in real pain. And finally, Roger Kaiser. He claims there was little pieces of lip on the bed which boys had bitten off as they were being beaten. He says he jumped up and looked at the staffer, and the look on that man's face told him all he needed to know. Roger says he felt certain the man was going to beat him to death. Some former inmates allege being flogged until they lost consciousness. Sadly, the alleged mistreatment at the school reportedly didn't end when the boys stepped out the doors of the White House. Allegations have been made that there was a dungeon in the cellar of the dining hall where sexual assault would take place. One survivor of the school reports witnessing a boy tumbling in an industrial clothes dryer before his body was later removed. Another alleges they saw a boy beaten and left to die in a bathtub. He guessed the boy had been mauled by the dogs after trying to run away, but he never did find out for sure. One former student claims he was ordered to dig 3 holes behind the chow hall, but only at nighttime, 4 feet deep and as long as a boy. One man who did an interview with WSRE Pensacola told a sickening story, in which he alleged that once when the boys were being made to take their clothes off and receive their physical and vaccination shots, one boy was grabbed inappropriately by a doctor who giggled. He alleged that 10 minutes later the doctor approached the boy to give him his shots, and the boy was crouching down and freaking out, saying, "No, no, no," and trying to back away. At this point, the man alleged that the doctor grabbed the boy, started slapping him, and said, "Shut up, shut up, shut up." Another horror story was highlighted just recently, when the first body exhumed from the school grounds was identified. The deceased boy's sister then told the following story. The 14-year-old boy named George Owen Smith had apparently tried to run away a few weeks into his stay at Dozier. When he was caught, she says he eerily wrote home to his family, "I got what was coming to me." After that, they never heard from him again. When his mother eventually grew worried and wrote to the superintendent asking where he was, she was allegedly told he had run off again and they had no idea where he was. The mom was not having it, and one day she wrote to the school, saying she would be driving to Marianna and would not leave until she knew what happened. At this point, 4 months had passed since his disappearance, but miraculously, the day before his mother arrived to investigate, the school allegedly found his severely decomposed body under a house all of a sudden. They purportedly offered the explanation that he'd caught pneumonia and died there. This explanation never sat right with Owen's family, and another student later told them he was with Owen when he actually made the second runaway attempt. He alleges that he last saw the boy fleeing across an open field as 3 men fired rifles at him. To make matters even worse, it is alleged that although Owen's family told authorities to hold the boy's remains at a local funeral, as they made the drive to Marianna, when they arrived, they say they were only shown a mound of dirt by the superintendent and were told that he was already buried in an unmarked burial ground. It is heartbreaking to imagine how many others could have met a similar fate as Owen, and how it must have felt to be a student at the school just seeing others, maybe acquaintances or friends, just disappear without a trace, and wonder if you were going to be next. Those who were lucky enough to survive their time at the school have emphasized just how much the constant stress from the unhealthy environment during their crucial formative years has impacted their lives even all these years later. Many reportedly struggle with alcoholism or substance abuse, and some simply fell back into a life of crime.
Always in a state of fear and intimidation, never no love shown or kindness. You carry this story with you your whole life, and you don't realize how much anger you have in you, which, I have been married 3 times, and I can guarantee that most of us that endured the beating there, even though we may have not beat our kids or anything, our wives, just the anger inside was very quick to be shown if things didn't go our way. And I know the wives endured very nasty, foul language coming out of my mouth when I was angry, but I never took and beat my children because of what I had went through. Did I give them a little spank with my hand? Yes, but I could just never think of how someone as big as these people were could take and beat a child the way they did.
Charlie emphasizes how little communication they were allowed with the outside world.
We were made to basically write a letter home. I don't remember if it was once a week or once a month. Letters going out and coming in were always censored, and if you didn't write things that were good about the facility, then they would take and make you rewrite the letters.
Charlie claims that mentioning anything about what went on in the White House was strictly off the table.
Definitely. If anybody ever told parents about anything that went on there, you were subject to a beating.
But there was yet another awful reason why the boys would get beaten, and it stemmed from segregation. Unfortunately, like most educational institutions at the time, the Dozier School divided their campus into 2 sections. The south side was for white students, while the north side was designated for black students.
And, when I was there, you had the white campus and the black campus. We were not allowed to speak with the blacks or vice versa. If you were ever caught speaking to a black person when they were on the white campus, that was an automatic beating down at the White House.
This trend of racial discrimination at Dozier leads us to another really questionable part of the school's procedures. I'll preface this by saying, and I think you'd agree with me, that from what we've seen so far, this reform school was not doing a great job reforming anyone. And as far as the school part, Charlie is just one of many who feel they learn no useful knowledge nor skills during their time on campus.
It was just basically a detriment to our lives. No, they did not teach us anything other than to have fear of anyone and everyone. We just felt that everybody was out to get us and against us.
Which begs the question, what was the real purpose of the Dozier School? Well, many have proposed a singular reason that I wouldn't have initially thought of, but when you hear it, it sounds so obvious. Labor.
You went to school one day and you worked for one day. You had various jobs. My brother George was on the field crew where they did all the planting and gathering of food that they sold and we also shared in. And I was on the land crew where we took and kept the grounds mowed and cleared, and the only kind of lawnmowers we had was the old push lawnmowers that had the cylinders. Nothing gas. It was all just manual labor. It was basically slave labor. Most of the people that were sent there and beaten and abused ended up with their whole life screwed up. Most of them ended up in prison, and very sad and shameful.
Many now theorize that a top priority of the Dozier staff was procuring as many students as possible in order to secure what could essentially be seen as slave labor. The campus reportedly featured a dairy farm, brick plant, and printing press, where the boys were made to work, and those businesses raked in hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue for the establishment. Perhaps this greed could explain the overpopulation of the school, and why so many boys were admitted for such seemingly petty reasons. Maybe staff wanted to pack as many boys into the cottages as possible in a bid to secure more free laborers. What's more, while the white students were reportedly put to vocational work like woodworking and industrial shops where they may be able to get a certificate, the black students were reportedly forced to work in the fields. Atlanta Black Star reported that they even were made to cut down timber in gator and snake-infested swamps. And just to further highlight the racial disparity which was prominent at the school, a later report found that African American boys were 3 times as likely to be unnamed in historical records and buried in unmarked locations. It is evident that there was no shortage of alleged corruption and secrecy going on at this institution. Now countless men say that both the physical and mental scars inflicted upon them have yet to fully fade. As for the end of Charlie's story at the school, he says after the traumatic early experience he allegedly went through at the White House, he kept his head down and tried to fly below the staff's radar as much as he could.
After that beating that I had endured, I just kind of kept to myself, kept my mouth shut, and worked very hard just to get out as soon as possible. Basically went from the bottom of the ranks to the very top of the ranks, and then once I had reached the top of the ranks, I think I was home within 3 or 4 weeks after reaching the top category. They gave me, I think, a quarter and put me on a bus to go back to Bradenton where my mother was, and at that point they allowed me to buy a pack of cigarettes.
The once intimidating White House building is now a defunct storage unit, closed permanently in 1967, just 1 year before all corporal punishment was officially banned at the school. But the atrocities it is alleged to have seen can never be erased. At a ceremony in October of 2008, an emotional moment took place at the site. White House Boys members placed a historical plaque recognizing the abuse on the cold concrete White House, sending a message that they were taking the power back. At that time, the state sealed the building. I asked Charlie what spurred him to speak openly about his experience and how the collective unit of the White House Boys came to be.
My brother George had passed away. I guess he had heard something about the story on a news channel, and the more that we had heard about it, a group was formed that was called the official White House Boys. And we would take and have a yearly meeting and, was helpful to one another, telling our stories to each other and having something positive come out of something that was so evil.
And yet, despite all the men who have come forward with similar stories, claiming to have experienced abuse at the hands of Dozier School staff, it seems like no consequences have ever been dealt to any of the men who have been named in the allegations as those who carried out the punishments. Past investigations have been closed because they could not either substantiate or dispute the claims due to the passage of time, and a lawsuit was shut down because the statute of limitations had run out. It's interesting to note that family members have come to the defense of the accused former staffers. They feel the allegations are false or exaggerated and emphasize that the people they know wouldn't have done such things to children. Still, the White House boys say they saw a different side of these men.
Tidwell, I think, was one of the very last staff members that died here a couple weeks ago in his 90s. And he was the one-armed guy that was one of the worst beaters of them all. He was very, very, very strong. He could take a boy that was 12 or 14 years old with his one hand and just snatch him up by the neck off the floor. I regret that I was not there because after being on the lawn crew, you don't have a choice of where they take in and move you. And they moved me from being on the lawn crew to becoming Tidwell's office boy.
Charlie and I went on to speak a bit about the multitude of graves found at Dozier, and he spoke on some of the odd findings from these exhumations.
There was one body that was supposedly sent to Pennsylvania, and Dr. Kimberly went up and had that supposedly body exhumed from where it was buried, and they opened the casket. There was no body in it. It was just old scrap wood that had been placed there to make weight for people to assume that there was a body in it because it was a closed casket when it was buried. In another one of the graves, they also found a buckshot in one of the caskets of a young boy.
Hearing this, I asked Charlie how he thinks most of these children died. It was hard for me to see how anyone could just brush off the discovery of so many graves and say it could have all been the result of natural causes.
I'm positive that some of the children were beaten to death and probably caused a heart attack. The facility where they took and beat us, they took and made you bury your head in a nasty pillow, which it was an iron cot, a little single cot. And you had to close your eyes and bury your head in that pillow and hold on to that cot while they beat you. And if you turned loose of that cot, they would go to the kitchen and get the kitchen boys to come over and hold you down while they beat you.
Nowadays, the campus is abandoned, its buildings breaking down as a result of hurricane damage and years of neglect. But despite all the investigations that have been performed on the grounds, Charlie still has questions that remain unanswered.
And I have always said that the graveyard that's called Boot Hill is over on the black campus. And when I was there, I always saw a graveyard that was on the white campus. And I've been told that it is a historic graveyard, and they have never taken and done any kind of ground-penetrating radar or any kind of flyover radar. They, I feel, do not want to explore that graveyard. They say it's not on the property. I think when I was there that it was part of the property because it was always cleanly mowed and kept up, and now you can't even see the graveyard because of the overgrowth. When Dr. Kimberly did their last examination of the property, they used a lot of the older LiDAR things. We were promised to go up there when they did that to where we could point out specific areas. That was promised to us by Secretary Lee, which that never happened. And at the last conclusion of Dr. Kimberly's report, some of us was there in Tallahassee, And I had told Secretary Lee she was there at that, and I had told her and anyone that was there that, until I was there and actually seen all of the LIDAR that was supposed to have been done, that I would never take it for fact that the mission was completely done proper. I know there's boys still buried on that property somewhere in my heart. And from the cottage that I was in, I remember seeing that historic graveyard every day. And now, because of the growth, you cannot see it at all. I just know that there's boys that's buried in that cemetery. I don't care if they call it historic or whatever. They found boys buried on top of boys over in the Boot Hill Cemetery. And that property was so big back in 60 and 61, and there was no fences around it back then. They eventually put the fences up, I guess, when they started taking older kids in there. Anything that they can brush around or brush off, they're going to. They do not want to find any more bodies. And they have check-in sheets and sheets where people checked out. And there's like 180, I think, boys that showed was checked in but never checked out. Where are these boys at? It's horrifying that they are doing this. The FDLE came in and took all of the records, and I understand they destroyed the records. I don't know why the FDLE would do anything like that. And, there was Postmaster, Mr. Dixon. He was also the scout leader, which very few people got to become scouts while there. And I was in the scouts and was on what was called the Beaver Patrol. And we was going for an outing off campus, and they had this yellow dump truck that didn't have a gate across the back. It only had a chain. And as we were leaving to go off campus, someone apparently hit the lever in the front, and there was like 7 of us boys that was on the back of that dump truck. And as it was coming up, the boys started falling off and jumping up and grabbing their heads. And I was the last one to get dumped off because I had put my feet up on the chain to hold me onto the back of the truck. And as that kept coming up higher, that chain started coming up higher as well with my feet against it. And after I had seen all the other boys had fallen off and was able to get up, I went ahead and fell off too. And I got 7 stitches in my head. And there's a boy that was named, his name was Billy Furr, which we've tried to find that boy. He had 77 stitches in his head. And I don't know if he died, if he's buried there or what, but we've tried and looked and can't find that Billy Furr that was also in the Scouts. But that was never, nobody has ever spoken about that at all. And that's amazing that our parents were not advised of that. But I'm sure they wanted to cover that up because of possible lawsuits for negligence.
Today, the fight for justice continues as authorities are faced with the realization that what they thought they knew about the Dozier School was only the tip of the iceberg. When I first started researching this case, I kind of assumed that the worst of the abuse had all occurred back in the mid-1900s. But according to EJI.org, the Justice Department released a report which asserted that even as late as 2011, Dozier inmates were being subjected to conditions that placed them at serious risk of avoidable harm and violation of their rights due to systemic, egregious, and dangerous practices. I wonder what injustices these more recent students may have endured and how they are coping today as a result. As of 2021, the White House boys are still fighting for legislation that would pay them reparations as an attempt at compensation for the abuse they claim to have endured at the hands of the state. As of this year, they are still making trips to the Florida Capitol in efforts to drum up support for their cause. Pastor Johnny Lee Gaddy, who attended the school from 1967 to 1971, told reporters at one of these events his dream if they are successful, saying that all he wants is to get a boat and a truck so he can go fishing. I looked a little into his history at the school and found an article which states that he claims he once saw a boy's severed hand in the garbage he was made to haul out. Allegedly, he was warned to keep his mouth shut unless he wanted to end up in the same position. With so many traumatic allegations like these, I really hope that these men receive the closure they deserve. The bill the men are fighting for passed its first committee with only one no vote. Senator George Gaynor, who grew up near Dozier, has stated that he simply does not believe that 500 people were mistreated at the school.
There are people, especially the one person named Mr. Gaynor, that voted against a bill which he has ties to Jackson County. And a lot of us guys have made attempts to take and have a conference with Mr. Gaynor to get him to understand that this really took place and let him know that these things did happen, which deep down I feel that he knows exactly what happened there. The state could definitely make reparations to us old guy. I try to live off of a $975 a month Social Security check, and believe me, that doesn't take care of all of the needs that I have. And I cannot believe that there's not something that the state of Florida couldn't do to make things right for us people that are still living.
But there is still hope for the White House boys. As Senate sponsor Darrell Roussan is determined to make things right. Roussan helped to spearhead one of the biggest milestones in this case, a formal apology from the Florida legislature. It happened back in 2017 and acknowledged that the treatment of Dozier students was a violation of human decency. Now Roussan is speaking up to say that there must be a way for the great state of Florida to move past empty words of apology to concrete actions of retribution. He feels that the discovery of so many graves can't be rejected, that the bones are screaming out for justice. As we were finishing up our call, I asked Charlie if there was a petition people could sign or a fundraiser that could somehow help the White House boys in their continuing battle.
We've never asked for a fundraiser. We've all, when we've had a meeting of everyone, tried to all chip in to fund that. We would love for the state to, so many of us have died. I'll be 74 in October. I honestly think the state's waiting till we're all dead before making some kind of reparations. And, I know how bad I was beaten when I was there, and I can only imagine the abuse that the black boys had to endure as well.
Although the White House boys don't ask for much, one spokesperson I chatted with did say that writing to officials like the governor, Speaker of the House, or President of the Senate to ask for justice for the former students of Dozier would be a way to help the cause. One thing is for sure, these men will never give up the fight. Long-standing member and current White House Boys President Jerry Cooper once said, "I want it out there what happened to us. Don't feel sorry for us. Feel proud that we brought it out into the open."